Chapter 13. Into the Woods. Princess Ava had Chris sit down by the fireplace through which he had just entered. She sat across from him, leaning forward in her chair, eager to hear all that he had to say. "Did you deliver the note to Rudy?" she asked him with urgency. Chris nodded. "Yes, and in fact he ended up making me a member of the Shepherds because of it," Chris replied. "We've been trying to decipher its meaning, but I'm afraid we still have no idea what is meant by Percy's parchment. From what you overheard Renier say, it seems your father is the only one who knows of its whereabouts." Ava thought about what Chris had just said. "Yes, I think so too," she replied. "I didn't approach my father about it before he left, and now I fear—" Her voice began to choke with emotion, and Chris instinctively placed his hand upon hers. "He's alive," Chris promised. "I can feel it. But we need to find him before your brother takes power. Is there anything you can tell me? I need more than that note to help you save the kingdom. Have you noticed anything else peculiar going on with the prince?" A very serious look suddenly appeared on Ava's face. "You won't believe me," she stated quietly. Chris chuckled. "With all due respect, Your Highness, I would not have risked my life venturing into this castle to have a conversation with someone whose word I did not trust. Please tell me what you know." Ava took a deep breath and let it out. "Only one guard from my father's caravan survived the attack in the forest," Ava started, but then stopped. "Do the shepherds know about the attack in the forest?" "Yes, Paul shared with us what he had overheard. Something about a terrible beast taking them by surprise." Ava nodded. "According to the survivor, this beast wreaked havoc on the men, nearly killing him and, as far as we know at this point, leaving no other survivors. All he remembers from this battle with the beast is that he was able to injure the claws of the beast." She looked at her own fingers and bit her lip, as if hesitating to finish her thought. "This is the part that will make me sound foolish. My brother's hand has been bandaged for the past few days, an injury that he will not explain to me." Chris's eyebrows furrowed with concern. You think Prince Renier is the beast that attacked your father?" Ava looked Chris directly in the eyes. "I do," she answered sincerely. "He is a man obsessed with the supernatural, with dark magic. Much of his time is spent alone with wizards and sorcerers that he has secretly summoned from faraway places. I do not know how it all works. I do not wish to know. But I fear Renier did not just orchestrate this attack. I believe he was directly involved in it." Chris had not expected to hear such a story as this. If the princess's fear was accurate, the shepherds had a greater threat facing them than they could have ever imagined. Could his attacking the king have something to do with Percy's parchment then? He asked her. "I'm not sure," she replied. "What I wrote on that note is as much a mystery to me as it is to you. I do not know what the parchment is or why Renier wants it. But it does seem that my father has some connection to it, and if my brother is trying to lay hold of it, I can only assume it is because it would strengthen his power in some way." Although Chris had been listening attentively, now that he was able to sit for a moment, he was beginning to feel the pain in the foot he had injured from his jump off the bell tower. He stood and started to pace around the room, trying to gauge how bad an injury it was. "Are you hurt?" the princess asked with concern, noticing the winces on Chris's face. "We must find your father," Chris concluded, continuing to gingerly test his foot and ignoring Ava's question. "If he is still in those woods, we must find a way to rescue him." "Renier has sent a search party," the princess replied, though her voice trailed off as she realized how unconvincing that was after just accusing him of murder. Chris raised his eyebrows. "Yes, forgive me if that idea brings me no comfort or confidence, Your Majesty. If the king is going to be found, it will have to be through our own efforts. And if I have your blessing, I will return to the shepherds and tell them." Chris's voice was suddenly drowned out by the loud ringing of the bell tower. The clanging of the bells was rapid, and Chris could picture the guard pulling wildly on the rope to make such a sound. Ava and Chris looked at each other with fear in their eyes. "They're signaling the alarm," she stated. "They know you're here." Before Chris could respond, a loud pounding at Ava's chamber door now accompanied the clanging of the bells. "Princess, are you in there?" came a muffled voice from the other side of the door. Chris did not hesitate. He pushed Ava back into the chair from which she had just stood up upon hearing the bell's sound. Ripping off one of the thin curtains by her balcony, he wrapped it around her tightly, using it as a kind of rope to trap her to the chair. "What are you doing?" she demanded of him with distress in her voice. Chris looked around the room and saw a large handkerchief resting next to a book on the table by her bookshelves. The princess was clearly an avid reader, as a corner of her room served as a small library with tall shelves lined with books, some that could only be reached with the assistance of a ladder that rested in the corner. Chris grabbed the handkerchief as the pounding at the door became more urgent. "They can never, ever suspect that you and I were talking about the prince," Chris explained. "They can never know that I came here specifically to speak to you. We must act. You must act as though I am a madman who snuck into your room, tied you up, and stole your treasure." Ava looked at him, her heart pounding. "Then steal something," she said calmly with a smile. Chris smiled as he leaned in, and before tying the handkerchief around her mouth, he obeyed his princess's directive and stole a kiss. He then ran to the corner of the room and grabbed the ladder. Suddenly, the door of the chamber burst open, revealing 3 guards standing at the door. Their immediate attention was brought to the princess, silenced and bound to the chair by the fireplace. They rushed to her aid and began untying her, not even noticing Chris, who was standing by the books in the corner, holding the ladder. As the guard undid the handkerchief around Ava's mouth, she started to scream. "He's here!" she cried out. "The villain is here!" The guards looked around the room, and as they did, Chris darted from his hiding spot, ladder in hand, to the open balcony. He threw the ladder over the edge and looked back for a brief moment before he jumped over himself. His eyes met with Ava's before the rushing guards blocked their view of each other. Even as she put on her show to fool the guards, he could see the concern in her eyes for her new friend, and she could see the love in his. Chris leaped daringly over the edge of the balcony, landing feet first into the deep waters of the moat after a long fall. He swam to the ladder that had started to float away and tried to plant it into the ground nearest the muddy walls of the moat, but the water kept forcing the ladder upwards towards its surface. Chris submerged himself in the water and tried to create a secure anchoring for the ladder. As he did, he felt something hit him hard against his back, pushing his body against the wall. The water was somewhat murky, but as Chris looked around for the culprit, he could make out a giant reptile in the water. The crocodiles had not been a story. As his new enemy swung its body around in order to go in for the kill, Chris grabbed the ladder again and stood upon its bottom rung, forcing the ladder to sink to the bottom and lodge itself somewhat into the mud. As he did so, the crocodile lunged toward Chris, who quickly ascended the ladder, now partially above water. The crocodile crashed into the ladder, momentarily pinning itself between the rungs and thereby further pushing and anchoring the ladder against the wall of the moat. Chris took advantage of this brief moment of stability and finished his ascent of the ladder, summoning all his energy to pull his body out onto the open grass above the moat. He lay on his back for a moment, trying to catch his breath. From this new position, he could see the princess's balcony, which now had close to a dozen guards gathered upon it. Several were armed with bows, and Chris suddenly realized that arrows were flying down toward him. He rolled over and pushed himself off the ground, his heart racing and his injured foot throbbing. He ran clumsily for the protection of the forest trees to the south, arrows landing in the ground all around him, with the alarm signal of the bells still ringing in the air.